Because otherwise, why consult after you've developed all the ideas? Or consult in these sort of
I'll catch you
slightly so ways where
drinks.
It's not real, or everyone is pulling their punches because they're worried about
Sorry?
I've gone so quickly.
Oh my goodness.
That
is very impressive.
Thank you.
Oh, it looks so different from the last time I saw
it.
it.
Shall we get going?
You know you're not allowed to start talking until you're told to.
I know.
But I have got.
Thank you very much. Let's we'll make a start. Are we good to go? Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to all of you online. This is the first of a series called How to Make Good Things Happen. And the inspiration behind this was us reflecting about what are the big successes that have happened in the last decade, in the last 2 decades, either here or elsewhere, and what can we really draw out for the future. It's very easy to think about the failures, or to sort of think that nothing is possible, that no policy change can drive major improvement. But when you look at the facts, there are so many stories of success that we wanted to showcase, highlight, and really mine the lessons of. The actual inspiration for this series was Moira, who said, look, we've got to sort of remember and uncover the actual lessons rather than lose the great work that's happened in this country and elsewhere. So this is the first of a few different events. We'll be looking at things such as offshore wind in the Netherlands or housing policy in other countries, as well as sort of interesting successes here like the minimum wage. Today we're going to be starting with a focus on teenage pregnancy. And I'm delighted that Moira Wallace, who was the founder of the Social Exclusion Unit back in the 90s and then came up with the teenage pregnancy strategy, is able to join us. And I'm going to ask Moira to talk to us for about 15 or 20 minutes, outlining what that strategy was, how it came to be quite so successful, but also what are the lessons for us going forward. We'll then have a conversation between the two of us and then throw it open to some questions if we've got time. So thank you again to you online and in person for joining us, and I'm going to hand over to Moira.
You're just taking my presentation.
Did not do that.
Well, hello everybody. It's a pleasure to participate in such a smooth team as we've just demonstrated. And hello to everybody here and hello to everybody online. I think there's a small teenage pregnancy coordinator army watching online. So nice to know they're listening. So I have been given the task of explaining the teenage pregnancy strategy in less than 20 minutes. You will see if I succeed. What was it? Did it work? What can we learn? The reason I'm talking about it is actually 2 reasons. First of all, back in the day, I headed the Social Exclusion Unit that wrote it. But the second one is that long after I left the subject area, I got drawn back into youth policy through research. And I've been doing some research at LSE looking at youth policy over the last 20 years, which is a story of many twists and turns. And that gave me a chance to look at what the data had been doing on subjects like teenage pregnancy, and I found it very interesting. So here we go. What was the teenage pregnancy strategy? I give you a picture of it. It was an actual document, and it was a government policy package that was issued in the summer of 1999. The work was commissioned by Tony Blair as Prime Minister, and it was put together by the Social Exclusion Unit, which I led. This was a cross-cutting unit in the Cabinet Office, and it was quite small, but it had people from lots of different government departments, from local authorities, from different frontline services, from the voluntary sector. So it was joined up in the term of the time. We did the work, but the work was agreed by ministers across government, and I'd like to particularly mention someone who championed it from the very start, the late Tessa Jowell, who took an interest in this work when it was being thought up and really championed it in implementation. The Social Exclusion Unit moved on to other topics, I moved on to other things, but the strategy was followed through for more than a decade by people like Alison Hadley, who's sitting here, who ran the Teenage Pregnancy Unit, and by an awful lot of people across the country. When I say the country, mostly I'm talking about England, but actually quite soon after we launched the strategy in England, similar strategies were set up in at least Scotland and Wales. So, why were we asked to look into teenage pregnancy? Why tackle this issue? Well, lots of reasons. Most teenage pregnancies are unplanned, and now about half of them end in abortion. So that's one thing you might like to think of as a cost of teenage pregnancy. But many people go on to teenage birth, and while this is not a blanket truth, often the outcomes are really difficult. It's very difficult for mothers, for fathers, and children. Many are already vulnerable. Many have experienced this as a complete shock. They're struggling for money. They're struggling for housing. It's not an easy environment to thrive in. Not least because the fact of the pregnancy in those days often stopped the mother's schooling. Bang. Sometimes you were even excluded for being pregnant in case it was contagious. Teenage pregnancy was a problem all across the UK, but there were huge inequalities. So deprived areas and vulnerable groups had much higher rates of teenage pregnancy. And yet there seemed to be a problem that in Europe we were uniquely bad at. We were doing much worse than other Western European countries. So in sum, all this led, I guess, to the Prime Minister thinking it would be good to reduce the teenage pregnancy rate, and maybe it might be possible. So how do you approach a topic like this in the position we were in? By this stage, I think the Social Exclusion Unit had maybe done 3 or 4 other reports, and we had developed a sort of framework for looking at social problems like this and trying to understand it as we talked with other departments, as we talked with people at the front line. There are a few people in the room who could probably recite the next slide. Laughter. So this was a framework of questions that we more or less used in most of the things we approach. What is the problem? By which I mean, define exactly what you mean. What are the numbers? And what lies behind the averages? Does it look different in different places? Does it look different for different people? And why does it matter? This is key. It matters to people who are experiencing teenage pregnancy. It matters to their families. It matters to the children of teenage parents. And it also matters to the Treasury. And it is very important to make things matter to the Treasury. A lot of the issues the unit looked at had big financial costs. Why does it happen? I don't mean the basics of where do babies come from, but actually what sort of circumstances mean that will lead to someone ending up getting pregnant really young. What's their life like? What are their relationships like? What did they know about sex or contraception? The next one, which I've called the current system, is very painful for governments to do because it's about asking whether what government's doing is actually working. So you don't do this by starting a paragraph with the words, the government is investing record amounts in this and it's all going swimmingly. It actually involves saying, is it working? What's it like to be a user of these services? And the question we often ask, which can sound a bit severe, but who's in charge? By which I mean, is it anybody's job? Is it anybody's job to worry about teenage pregnancy? Is it anybody's job to help a pregnant teenager or a young mum? Then, of course, we looked at what works, what's promising, and all of this diagnosis, if I can call it that, would lead us to the question, so what needs to change and how to make it happen? And I'd like to emphasize, we did not do all this work sitting at our desk or reading research reports and talking to other departments, though we did all of those. But we spent a lot of time out on the road, talking to young people, talking to frontline services that had experience of these issues, trying to run them, trying to design them. Let me try and give you an example of what we got out of that sort of analytical process. I'm going to try one of the sort of why does it happen questions. So why were teenage pregnancy rates so high? We have the highest rate in Western Europe. Why? And there are different ways of putting it, but I think I would summarize it like this. First of all, we had lots of young people with risk factors, what we would now call social determinants. We had a lot of people in poverty, young people in poverty, very high rates of child poverty, a lot of people who were vulnerable, tons of people who disliked school and who had often stopped going, and sometimes people who had alcohol problems as well. I could add to that list, but that's a selection. And why does any of that matter? Because actually these are young people who don't have a lot of support, don't have a lot of control over their lives, don't have a lot of choices. And that's a contributor. But add to that our very British ability to be embarrassed about sex. So we had extremely poor sex education. Young people told us that. They found it embarrassing. They didn't tell them what they needed to know. And we also had really poor access to contraception. Somebody once said it feels as if sex is compulsory and contraception is illegal. And that's the sort of mixed message that actually young people were getting caught in the middle of that. And all of these things could be tackled and in a way were preventable, but that was nobody's job and it wasn't resourced. So let's call that a bit of the diagnosis. What was the response? So I'm going to talk through 5 elements. This is the first. A national programme. So the report announced a 10-year programme of prevention and support. It announced that we would be setting up a teenage pregnancy unit, the TPU, which started in the Department of Health and later moved to the Department for Children, Schools and Families. We set a target. It was a time of targets, and I'm quite a fan of targets, and this was one of the better ones, though it seemed very ambitious at the time. But the target was to halve the under-18 conception rate by 2010. And I won't pretend it was very scientific, but it was based on international comparisons and the idea that we ought to be able to approach the rates in other countries. You'll notice it says conception rate, it doesn't say teenage births. And that was quite deliberate. We didn't want a target that was about births, because actually one way of meeting that would be to have as many conceptions as you've ever had and just have more abortions. So we actually wanted to start further upstream and reduce the conception rate. And you'll also see that it wasn't all about trying to reduce conceptions, but it was also about recognizing that for all sorts of reasons, many teenagers will go on to have a baby and they need support, and that should be part of the strategy too. And these were the days of Sure Start. So Tessa Gell named a special initiative, Sure Start Plus, to support teenagers with a baby. There was money, 30 million odd a year. Most of it went out to local areas, and it sounded sort of fussy when we wrote this in the report. There should be a national unit, there should be local coordinators. I'm now really glad we did that, because I think it was key. And actually that there should be, money was, amongst other things, to appoint someone in every local authority who could draw together what was happening there and try and act on all the prevention opportunities. Second element, improving sex and relationships education. So statutory guidance was issued on sex and relationships education. That may sound familiar, it's still in the news. I think that might have been the first time there was ever statutory guidance, but trying to raise the quality. And very importantly, it was accompanied by lots of training. We still hear about teachers who are really math teachers and get roped into teaching sex education, thinking, oh, nothing has prepared me for this. Really, really important that there's training and that all the people who are going to be involved in it or need to support it know about it, including school governors, faith groups, and so on. I said I'd been researching how all this went in implementation. I was really touched when I looked back at some of the things that were done to make sure that sex education got to everybody. So actually, what are we going to do about the people who are not in school? What are we going to do about the people who might be in prison? What are we going to do about people who are not in a mainstream school or who've got extra needs? All of this was thought about in implementation. Brilliant job of implementation. And recognizing that these conversations don't only happen in school, there were big national media campaigns direct to young people, very hard to miss, and also to parents, giving people actual practical guidance on how to have a conversation about this with their children. I've left out one bit I want to mention, which is really important. It's really important that this education links to practical information about what I do in the town I live in. So it doesn't just say, you should be able to find a clinic. It actually tells you where it is, what its name is, what its opening hours are, makes all that possible. This has to be impossible to miss, so the two need to be linked. Contraceptive access is obviously key to this. Picture your local GP surgery and imagine that you're 13 and you want to go in and make an appointment for the first time without your mother to ask about contraception. I feel intimidated by the thought, and I'm a reasonably confident person. How do you make contraceptive services youth-friendly? How do you put them in convenient locations, and how do you reassure people about confidentiality? Above all, how do you normalize the subject? How do you make it possible for someone to have thought about contraception before they need it? And how do you increase uptake of the most effective methods? So actually, this is one of what I think was one of the real breakthroughs in implementation of the strategy, which was, I'm going to use a terrible shorthand name, which is LARCs, which stands for long-acting reversible contraception. So this is implants and injections, which are a really effective means of contraception. They were known about and they existed when we wrote the strategy, and they work extremely well, particularly from teenagers who might forget to take their pills or might find it hard to discuss condoms. They're a really, really good solution for young people. And in the second half of the 2000s, in response to the fact that actually the numbers were falling a bit slowly, the government decided to make a big push to get this offered in clinics and did this GB-wide. There's a really good evaluation of this and the difference it made. And there was money behind it, as you can see, quite a lot of money. So far I've been talking about what you might call sort of classic sexual health policies, but the strategy was really helped by developments outside the sexual health world. And that was no accident. I'm going to move on to talk about schools. So I've already mentioned that actually a lot of evidence about who is most likely to become pregnant in their teens or become a parent in their teens focuses on girls who are getting bored with school, they hate school, they've stopped going, they intend to leave at the first opportunity, they find the whole experience repellent. And obviously, for multiple reasons, at this point, the government was trying to make that different. This was a time of huge investment in schools. The funding was targeted on deprivation. It funded an enormous increase in teachers and support staff. And it was also a time when the curriculum became much more flexible, much more vocational, and subjects, it became possible to study for your GCSE subjects that many young people had always wanted to study and that they saw as leading them on to what they wanted to do. There was also a real push on school absence, untiring and comprehensive. I feel very strongly about school absence. It was very, very high when the Labour government came to office, and they had quite a lot of success in reducing it, which might be the subject for another talk. But it's clearly relevant to teenage pregnancy. And finally, I shouldn't forget the educational maintenance allowance, which funded low-income young people to stay on in school after 16, because a lot of people who would have liked to stay on in school felt they had to leave because they needed to provide an income. So a lot of these things were helpful for teenage pregnancy. I moved on to a different topic, which you may be surprised to see here, which is a government alcohol strategy. In fact, perhaps I should put an exclamation mark after it, because these things are rare. We don't have one at the moment. The Labour government was a bit slow to get to grips with alcohol, if truth be told, but they did around 2003 and onwards, and realised that alcohol abuse was imposing huge costs on a range of public services, including the health service and the police. And a lot of measures came in that I think were pretty effective, and they did have an impact on young people. First two are about legislation, so you will still see notices in public parks saying you cannot, don't even think of drinking here. And a lot of that was brought in at that period. And the reason those of you who look a bit younger are occasionally asked to prove your age in supermarkets is because of a lot of measures that were put in place in the 2000s, basically to prosecute retailers who sold underage. And the retailers responded by saying, we have to make this impossible to get wrong. There was also a lot of information about alcohol. Liam Donaldson, who was the chief medical officer, issued new guidance for parents about the health risks, which came as a great shock to most parents who were told that they shouldn't really be introducing their kids to alcohol before the age of 15, and then ideally not very much. And there were also a lot of advertising campaigns aimed at young people, urging them to think, did they want to get drunk? If they didn't want to get drunk, how were they going to handle things? Finally, on this slide, the inspiringly named alcohol duty escalator in the 2009 budget, which was Chancellor Alistair Darling saying, I need to restore the level of taxation on alcohol and increase it in real terms, which I'm sure he did partly because the government needed the money, but actually alcohol had been getting cheaper and cheaper. And it was quite valued as a public health initiative. The last point I want to make, while we're talking about prevention, is the wider picture. This was the era of child poverty policies, a huge increase in cash transfers to families with children, raising their incomes. I could tell you just as long a story about programs to prevent youth offending or to prevent drug use or to prevent school exclusion. There were resources that had never been there before and that aren't there now, like Connections Personal Advisors, which were trying to help people through these 13 to 19 years. Sure Start, I probably don't need to explain, but later, some of the kids we see later in our graphs benefited from Sure Start. And there was also Every Child Matters, which was a framework written by, who was it, Ravi? You, which was about looking at outcomes for children overall and trying to improve them. The point I'm trying to make is that teenage pregnancy may seem quite a niche subject to some people, but actually it's one element of a set of policies that were at the heart of that government and that were at the heart of what both Blair and Brown wanted to do, and had a lot of attention and a lot of resource, and most of which have disappeared. So, move on to some data. What happened to the data? Here come the graphs. So this is the graph of the target that I referred to earlier, to half the under 18 conception rate. So I put a little green circle around the magic moment when it happens, and you will notice that this is 2014, not 2010. So it was met late. Actually, it was nearly met on time in one part of the country, which was Inner London, which is a quite interesting story, given all the other things that went right in Inner London in terms of education. So Inner London halved the under 18 conception rate by 2011. But you see that this is a sort of slow decline and then a very steep decline. And this prompts lots of speculation about what bent the graph. But that picture, as I say, it was not the same in every area. There was a bit of a strategy refresh in the middle of that decade, an evaluation, goodness me, government evaluating its policies. and a decision to turn up the volume on some things, particularly on contraception. There was not a target for the maternity rate, so this is the number of births per 1,000 teenage women. But as you can see, that fell rather more evenly. And what that's telling you is that actually that line is falling in the early part of the period because there's still a lot of girls conceiving, but they're becoming more likely to have an abortion than they were before. So it's telling you of a change in view of, do I want an abortion or do I want to carry on? Some international comparisons would be good, and here is one. This is a European comparison, and I've kept it really simple. There are obviously more European countries than this. The UK is the dotted orange line at the top. I use UK because these figures are not available on an England basis, and because actually the numbers also fell in response to policies in Scotland and Wales. So this is births as well, not conceptions. So you can see the UK way out of line at the beginning, only Germany anywhere close. The two virtually flat lines at the bottom are France and Italy. And you can see that the rate was going down in Germany, but you can see how the UK really closed the gap, but was still higher at the end of the period. So how do we understand this fall? I've got, again, lots of graphs, but I'm just going to prepare you with a few spoilers. So first of all, more young people were using effective contraception, and perhaps surprisingly to some, it looks as if the proportion of young people who had sex in their early teens fell. So again, we're in sort of fairly classic sexual health territory here, but I'm going to argue that I think some other factors also played a role. So I'm going to say that I think falling school absence and better GCSE results and more staying on after 16 contributed, and the reduced drinking contributed, and less going out, which we might discuss, contributed, and wider youth policies. So let me bombard you with some more data. Contraception. So I'm using a couple of data sources here. The one on the left is answers to a school survey. It's a really long-standing international school survey. And this is 15-year-old girls who have had sex. Did they use the pill? They're also asked if they used condoms. And this shows that the proportion who used the pill went up from 23% to into the mid-30s. The one on the right is data from sexual health clinics, and it shows a fairly steep rise in under 17s who are using LARCs. So this is long-acting reversible contraception, implants and injections, and this really soars. So in the mid-2000s, this is 10% of attendees amongst 16 to 70-year-olds, and by 2014, it was 30%, and then it was approaching 40% a bit later. So this is a very big change. This is people becoming aware of something, having it offered to them, and deciding that's what I'm going to use. So there is more contraception. I think when we wrote the strategy, lots of people would have said, oh, you know what's going to happen if you give people more contraception? They're going to have more sex, but possibly not. So this is quite hard to find out about, but happily this school survey asks people, it asks 15-year-olds, have you had sexual intercourse? And this is girls' answers here for England. And in 2002, 40% of them said yes. And in 2018, that had more than halved. Slightly bobbed up again since then. The orange line is the same people saying, and this happened when I was 12 or younger. So it's a line I find quite alarming. And in 2002, 9% of 15-year-olds said, I have had sex already, and that happened when I was 12 or younger, which I think demonstrates quite an interesting situation, and that has fallen considerably, and look, it's gone up again recently. These are very, very fresh figures. So what about sort of wider risk factors? I've got a couple of education graphs to show you. The one on the left is school data, and this is for persistent absentees. So that's secondary school pupils who are missing 10% of their schooling or more. This was apocalyptically high, and it's apocalyptically high again now, but that's off my chart. But the government became able to measure this by individual pupil in the mid-2000s, when a quarter of secondary school pupils were missing more than 10%. And as you can see, that fell very steeply. So I would argue all the things that were done to make that fall steeply would be helping with teenage pregnancy, because it's more kids in school with support, with advice, engaged in what they're doing, seeing a future. Which leads me on to the right-hand graph, which may not look astonishing, but it is astonishing. And this is the proportion of all 17-year-old girls only, who are in full-time education. And this, in 1997, this was 61%, and by 2019, it was 82%. So there's a huge increase, a fifth of the cohort who weren't in full-time education at 17 when the Blair government came in, and who a couple of years ago, that fifth are now in full-time education. And indeed, that had increased quite a lot in that first decade. That makes a huge difference. That is that's how you're spending your time. That shows something that you've got a choice, and that's the choice you're making. Let's move on to another risk factor, alcohol. This is the school survey again. And this is, the blue lines are 15-year-olds, solid lines are boys, dotted lines are girls, the yellow ones are 13-year-olds, and this is people saying they have been drunk 2 or more times. And in 2002, more than half of 15-year-olds had been drunk 2 or more times, and that pretty much halved by 2018. And for 13-year-olds, it was approaching 30% had been drunk twice, which is quite a high number. And that had more than half by 2014. So I would say these graphs, I mean, I'm not just saying they look similar, but they are important falls in related indicators. Is this causation? I can't prove it. I don't know. Does it help? I think so. But all of this is part of a bigger change, which has been happening in parallel, which is how young people's social lives have changed. This is a different kind of graph. It's comparing data from 2 cohort studies that are almost a decade apart. How do you spend your time is the question. And the blue bars are how 13 and 14-year-olds answered in 2004, and the orange ones are 2013. And as you can see, the ones on the left have fallen. Going out somewhere with friends has fallen. Going round to a friend's house has fallen. Time with family has risen a little bit. Spend time by themselves has risen from 9 to 22. And that could be all sorts of reasons. It could be studying, it could be I'm miserable, it could be I'm online. I think it may be all of these, but it's a very different context to young people's social lives. So let me try and draw together the threads on teenage pregnancy. I would argue that teenage pregnancy fell because of improvements in sex education and improvements in contraception, because of increased engagement with education, and because of changes in alcohol use and patterns of socializing. And I think all of those reinforce each other in all sorts of ways. So if you drink less, you might be more likely not to miss school. If you're in school, you might be more likely to drink less, and so on. They're all related. And I think that these were all reinforced by other children and youth policies. And I'm going to indulge myself by zooming out a little bit. Teenage pregnancy is very memorable because the government said it was going to halve it, and eventually that's what happened. And people think that's the only thing that's ever halved. It's not. So permanent exclusions, another thing actually the social exclusion unit was involved in, that halved. Persistent absence in secondary schools, I've already shown you, fell 45% in 7 years, quite dramatically. Drug use, halved over about a decade. Child poverty fell by a third. I say this simply to remind you, or to make the point, that a lot of indicators of young people's success improved significantly during this time. And though I don't have time to show it to you, inequalities also reduced. This bigger picture is really important, and it shows what can be done. If you would like to be inspired with more stories like this, here is a shameless plug for a report I have written from which all these graphs come. Give a copy to all your friends. It's almost time for me to shut up, but the reason we've lured you in here is to talk about what we thought the lessons might be. So I'm being allowed to suggest some. I've put some lessons up about policy making. I will try and rattle through them. I suppose the first one is really about the social exclusion unit, but it could be a strategy unit, it could be in a department, but actually creating a strategic capacity and asking it hard questions is a really sensible thing for governments to do. They don't do it enough. The second one is about framing questions, or maybe framing issues in a way that will command support. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, it was great that someone asked us, how would why do we have such a high rate of teenage pregnancy and how would you reduce it, rather than giving us a headline that says, Minister vows to end teenage mums' access to council housing. They're very different propositions. We didn't do anything at all about council housing. But what I'm trying to say is it's really helpful to ask an open question and not to actually just announce a policy you like the sound of. It's really helpful to announce something in terms that will enable people to understand it, to identify with it, and to say, yeah, I can see why that's a good thing to do. The next one is about diagnosis. I think it's really important to understand all the causes of the issue you're dealing with and try and address them. So if I can take an example from another area I'm really interested in, school absence. I don't think it helps school absence to say, the problem is parents keeping their children away, I shall fine them. I mean, that might be one of the problems, but it's not the only problem. There are many other problems. And if you want to solve school absence, you need to deal with the other problems too. The fourth one is make the wider policy context supportive. The teenage pregnancy strategy was really lucky, but actually it wasn't an accident. It gained a lot of power from other things the government was doing that were pulling in the same direction. Very often, when you see a strategy struggling, it's because every other bit of government is pulling in the opposite direction. It's sort of obvious to say, but actually, I think that was one of the things that helped achieve the target. Some delivery lessons. Match your aspiration with actions and staff capacity, i.e., a target without any delivery is just a dream. And actually, although it's probably sounded fantastically boring that it said in our report, we were going to have a unit, we're going to have coordinators, actually that's what made it happen. And government can so often miss that bit out or leave it to someone else or just run out of energy or resources, but it was really important. Set a rational target. I've said there wasn't a lot of science in setting a target of 0.5, but it was rational. It was based on what other countries were able to achieve. And the important thing is if you set a target that you then get serious about it and you keep checking to see how you're doing, and if you need to change, you adapt. So I would say watch it like a hawk and not like an ostrich. If I could only have one lesson, it would be number 7, which of course has 3 components, but the important thing is that you have them all. National leaders, local leaders, shared purpose. I can think of so many policies that you watch from a distance and you think, well, I can see someone locally is doing something, but they're getting no help nationally, or I can see someone nationally is passionate about it, but I don't know where the army is. Where's their front line? Where are the people who are actually going to make that happen up and down the country? And the last one, prevention is permanent, i.e. you need to keep doing it permanently, and complacency is the enemy. In other words, keep going. And we haven't really, which is very sad. So those are my lessons. Over to our conversation.
Thank you very much, Maura. That was great. I guess my first question is, how do you get people to care in the first place? Which is a long way of asking you, how did you get this report commissioned?
So first of all, there was a big impetus from Number 10 behind this. I don't want to suggest that Tony Blair woke up every morning thinking, what can I ask the Social Exclusion Unit to do? But there were people in Number 10 who were thinking very hard about it, including Jeff Mulgan, who used to run this place and who thought up the whole idea of the Social Exclusion Unit. But by the time we were asked to do this, we were suggesting it. It didn't come out of a clear blue sky. And I think we did a sort of mini analysis. We said, well, here's why we think there's a problem. It's significant. There's some reason to think that we could do a lot better. And why should we be asked to do it? Well, there was a sort of criterion that it had to be issues that span more than one department. Otherwise, it just looked like we were diving into departments and saying, oh, let us. So it met those criteria. And I think we didn't have to make them care about it. They did. And I think, so why did they care about it? I had worked for a Conservative government. I saw that change of government through. And what I really noticed was two things that are relevant to this. The first is that the incoming government, for whatever reason, was much more familiar with data and evidence and international comparison. So they had a greater sense of what might be possible. And the other thing was that they just represented completely different constituencies. And so they were very, very familiar with the circumstances in which absence or drug use or teenage pregnancy were at really high levels, and they had watched these as constituency MPs and thought, if I ever get into government, that's the sort of thing I want to be working on, I guess.
And can I ask about sort of England and Wales and Scotland? This was a predominantly England-only policy, is that right?
Well, England only sort of sound like we were saying Scotland, no, you must carry on as you are. So most of the things that the unit did were shadowed quite closely, often about a year later, by Scotland and Wales. And I think there were social exclusion units, at least in Scotland. Yeah. So I think a couple of years later, there were strategies that looked quite a lot like this. And that were attuned to their circumstances. And some of the policies were just national policies. So, for example, the NHS decided it was going to promote implants and injections, and it did that GB-wide. It is quite striking that Scotland and Wales followed really very similar trajectory.
I guess one thing, when you look at England, Scotland, Wales, and also the other countries that dropped a lot, particularly the US, which went down, is it that they were all doing quite similar policies in terms of expanding access to contraception, or was it sort of other social changes that were happening? What can we learn from the international comparisons?
So I might be able to show you a graph, but let me try and answer the question without it. So it's really interesting that rates were much higher in what were known as the Anglo-Saxon countries. And I used to think this was hilarious. Are you suggesting that it is a risk factor for teenage pregnancy that you speak English? This is strange. But by this, people meant the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Actually, what I think it meant was that there were very high levels of inequality in all those countries, and so they had a lot of the same risk factors. Of course, they were all trying to address this. In almost every one of those countries, you see a sort of point when implants and injectables suddenly became pushed much more. And I think the US led the way on that. But some of them didn't actually improve much. So New Zealand got a bit stuck and sort of went down and went up again. So I think there was a lot of catching up to do. I mean, if I can put it a different way, if you were to look at figures over a longer period, in maybe 1980, the UK did not look out of line with Western Europe, but then everybody else improved and the UK didn't. So you almost had to say, why did we not keep going then? So there was a catching up.
You list out a variety of different causes. To what extent do you think that, if you take contraception and sex education, would you say that represents sort of more than 50% of the of the impact, or how do you kind of?
I don't think you can ask the question that way. It's sort of like saying, this is a brilliant cake. How much of it is down to the flour and how much of it is down to the eggs? It's sort of, I think you've got to have it all there. That said, I think if you look at the trajectory and look at the evaluation in the middle of that decade, it was obvious that young people were telling us, and the data showed, that they were not getting access to contraception to the degree they wanted. But I don't think you could have made the progress that was made without the sex education and contraception policies and without the changes in the risk factors. I think they were all important, and you may think I'm being obstructive, but in a way this is the most important thing I'm saying. You need everything to go pretty well.
I think what's interesting about that is that, particularly with the growth of randomised trials, there's a sort of tendency to try to isolate the individual cause, because that's invaluable. But actually, big social problems often require multiple interventions. And so there's a risk of almost being biased to the actual evaluation method.
I would really agree with that. So, first of all, I mean, evidence is incredibly important, but if you say, therefore, I will only be able to do something that has been, I will consider myself unable to do anything that fails this super evidence test, then actually you can't govern sensibly. I mean, we make all sorts of decisions in life that haven't been through an RCT. We marry people, we buy houses, we pick jobs. You make decisions on the basis of common sense. And it's great when there's an RCT of something, but sometimes if you wait for that or you don't pursue a policy because it hasn't got one, you're making a mistake. The other thing I'd like to say is that actually sort of academic incentives all argue or work against doing really big joined up social research. So actually, the report I've written, I could never have done a PhD on that because I could never have proved any of it and because it was far too unfocused. But actually, if you think as a policymaker, you can't just sort of say, the great achievement of my next 10 years in government is going to be doing this tiny thing. Actually, you're responsible for all of it. You have to think about all of it.
I think the other interesting thing about the graphs is that I think you could say that policy's got a clear connection with, say, contraception use or sex education. The two that are, I think I'd be most surprised if I think back 20 years ago that they'd have shifted that much, are sexual activity and alcohol, because I think I would have probably thought those are just incredibly difficult to shift because they're big sort of social norms, cultural norms. I just wonder whether there's, have you got any insight into how and why those shifted?
Well, a bit. I might have to show you another graph, and I might sort of stagger on through. That's not what I want to show you, nor that. This is a different graph. So let me just show you a couple. This is a different graph about alcohol, and this is yet another survey. Children who have ever had a proper alcoholic drink, and the blue line at the top is obviously over time. The blue line at the top is 13 to 15-year-olds. It's really come down at all ages. And the next one is drugs. So this is proportion of people who have ever taken drugs. So I'd say two things about this. First of all, I know it seems very hard to believe a government policy could succeed in changing these things, but people did have policies and they might have worked. Second, and some of them were actually quite punchy. I mean, it got a lot harder for young people to buy alcohol. And, probably many people in this room can remember when that was not the case. And, I never had any problem, they say, but actually it's a lot harder now. You need to get someone else to do it for you. And just putting that sort of obstructive block in the way can be surprisingly effective. It's actually, I think you might call it a behavioural intervention. But the second thing I'd say is that across the industrialised world, the age of starting everything is rising. So there are people who write about, oh my goodness, people are having sex later, they're drinking later, they're getting their first job later, they're learning to drive later. And there is a whole ology behind this which is that actually this is the result of the fact that we're all getting educated and we want to be educated and we know we're going to have to be in education for ages until we become adults. So we're not just going to need to finish school, but do a degree, maybe a master's. And the whole transition to adulthood is just getting shunted a bit later because there's time and because there's the resources to do that. And I actually find that quite convincing. You sort of, and this might be part of it. But it could also be parents, parental attitudes. I mean, the government was working really hard to actually say to parents, if you think you're doing your children a kindness by introducing them to alcohol at 10, you're really not. So,
I wonder whether we can get onto the actual lessons. If you go back to the actual.
Go back.
So one lesson, I think possibly the first, is a strategic capacity. Create a strategic capacity and use it to ask hard questions.
Yes.
And I think what's interesting about this is when I first joined the Social Exclusion Unit, I'd actually not been in government before, and I just thought it was normal to ask what is the problem and really ask what are the causes and say
And then
why.
it all stopped when you left.
Yeah, what is happening in the current system and why is it inadequate, and ask those difficult things. And then I moved into another department, and the assumption was you just write a policy. You know, we all know what the analysis and the problem is, and we just need to write a policy. And here, in fact, I think I got given 2 months to come up with Every Child Matters and 2 people, and then I said no, I needed 9 months and 8 people. But it's quite unusual, I think, to spend the time going, why is this happening? I just wondered whether you think that is still true in government, or is it very varied? And you know, why is it not more normal?
So, it's a really great question. And I find it very frustrating because, of course, you know, I was free to indulge my way of thinking, so I got even more into this mode and did manage to do it in some other departments too. I think that it was, let me turn the question around, it was particularly possible to do it in this policy area because no one owned this policy area. So no one came in with, as the opposition spokesman on this thing, having got a policy prescription in their head. So there was a space free, and people thought, I've never really been able to get to the bottom of this. If you could, that would be fantastic. So there was a space. But honestly, why is it not more done? Search me, because it seems such an obvious way to start. So, I mean, I'm not sure this is the least controversial example to throw in, but let me carry on. The whole debate about migration, stop the boats, etc., I actually think, what can I read that would tell me how this system actually works? How it's supposed to work, how it actually works, who is where, why, how much that's costing, how it feels. You know, let me at it really. Well, I don't want to get involved in that policy area, but where would I find that to then judge different people's policies against? And I think in a lot of policy areas, we'd make faster progress if someone took the time to do that, actually.
Yeah. I think it's, as you said, it's slightly easier to say on teenage pregnancy, I don't know the answer, let's go away and think about it, whereas it's harder on your sort of main box office central plank of your electoral platform to sort of say, I don't actually know what the answer is up front. Although, you know, governments do commission reviews all the time.
Yes,
and, you know.
and so I don't think this is difficult. People just need to get used to doing it. And the world would be better if they did, perhaps.
Okay. Secondly, one of the lessons I think is about targets. And I think you refer to the idea of realistic targets.
I said rational.
Rational. Because I think there's 2 types of target you sometimes see. One is a sort of aspirational target. So child poverty, ending child poverty was 20 years moonshot. Others tend to be things which are quite realistic and you've calibrated that you can actually get there. I'm wondering, when you set this target, how well calibrated was it? Was it based on international comparisons that you thought, no, we can actually get that? Or was it a bit of a shot in the dark?
Well, both, but more the former. So, you know, you looked at other economies with which you shared some similarities and but as well as some differences, and thought, well, come on, if we take 10 years, could we not get to where they are now? And, you know, once you've sort of located it as roughly half, there's not a lot of benefit to be gained by saying, well, what about 45%? What about 55%? It's obviously a fairly broad brush. Yeah, but there was no more science to it than that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Then you said the most important one, the one that if you could only have one, was about national and local leadership and shared purpose. Why is that so important? And then why is it unusual?
Yes, why is it unusual? Well, so this was quite strange, because in a way we were planting a flag and saying this ought to be a policy area. It ought to have someone in charge in Whitehall, and it ought to have someone trying to deal with it locally. And we were sort of trying to create a sort of branch network, let's call it that. In some areas, you've got a branch network, but you never talk. So, does the Central Department of Education actually talk to schools, or anyone in between who's talking to schools? And you can sort of sometimes see that there's a war of words rather than an actual sense we're working on this together between, as it were, head office and branches. Now, I'm using the terms head office and branches, and they're inflammatory because actually these are local authorities and it's not like that. But it's the workforce. If you want to achieve something, do we imagine that a 14-year-old in Doncaster is waiting to hear what government thinks about teenage pregnancy? No, of course they're not. But they are living a life, and there are an enormous number of people around them who are paid by the central or local taxes. Can we help them to do something that will make this person's life much better and help, possibly save money or help them work more effectively? I mean, to sort of flip forward a little bit, Ravi and I were talking about, what could we apply these lessons to? So let me take a big leap to one of your missions, which is, what is your heat pump mission? Let's see if it's something that will command support. Just tell me what it is, and then I'll tell you why this one's so important.
Well, we want to decarbonise all homes in the UK, and we want to get to a certain level of decarbonisation by 2030 that's in line with our legal carbon budgets.
Okay, quite snappy, isn't
yes,
it?
Yes, I know.
Very snappy. Well, I think you could benefit from these lessons, but let's just look at the national leaders, local leaders, shared purpose. So, probably, well, there's you, but someone nationally, there's a department that is trying to do that, but may not share your mission. I mean, it has aspirations, but
it does in the sense that I think DESNZ would say we are trying to achieve the carbon budgets, and we know that decarbonising heat is a part of that, but it's maybe not as visible and pulled out as it could be.
And do you have local coordinators?
No.
Then there you are, that's number 7. So I need a confession here, because I used to work on this subject too, and I've just moved into a new house, and our boiler broke within our first month, and we've replaced it with another gas boiler. And I'm a golden example of the failure of this policy, in that nothing made me or helped me think this is the moment for the next 15 years, because it wasn't the moment, because I wasn't ready and I didn't know who to ask, and there's nobody where I live trying to make me do this or help me do this. And I think actually something like this would be absolutely transformed by local leadership. You can't have the teenage pregnancy coordinators though, because they need to deal with teenage pregnancy. But it's that, I'm sorry, I'm looking over at Alison, that's the sort of, you couldn't have done it without local coordinators.
Champions.
Yeah.
They led partnerships, they kind of forged the joint up working.
Yeah.
And they were all passionate about
Yeah.
it. And when you say, how do you get people to care? There was a whole army of people in the voluntary sector, sexual health and education, who really wanted this to happen. And they've stayed with the programme, actually, in very difficult circumstances for the last sort of 10 years. But it's that kind of enthusiasm, and you just need to give them the ammunition and the kind of the strategy and the road to walk down, and they will. So, but they were the people who kind of brought everything together locally, brought connections, and Sure Start and everyone together. They had their target, And they were just wonderful. You know, they're what made it happen. But then there was a regional team of regional coordinators who worked across government and regional level, and then there was a teenage pregnancy unit working across, and there was a kind of vertical communication both ways.
So
we heard when things weren't going right.
Exactly. So I had some experience of doing this a bit later in criminal justice when I was doing a job there, and I was then running a different kind of unit doing similar things, trying to make the criminal justice system join up. And first of all, you needed people in local areas to say, well, I'll tell you what doesn't work. And actually, they'd been dying to find someone who was listening, who would tell, to whom they could say, here's this enormous blockage, you could save an awful lot of money, you could speed things up, you could make victims' lives better. Or you'd find people who'd say, I have this fantastic idea, and we've implemented it in Nottingham, but how do I tell anyone else? And the answer is, you tell us, we tell them. I need to tell you it's 7 o'clock, by the way.
Okay, I mean, I think it's interesting that why do we sometimes
got a close eye on the clock?
Why do we sometimes not have local leaders? And I think it's 2 reasons. Sometimes, if you take teenage pregnancy, before the report, you might have thought, well, this is not a job of government to try and tackle these issues.
Yeah.
This is just a social phenomenon that happens.
And it sounds embarrassing as well and awkward.
Yeah. And I guess you could say the same now about social media and and phones, or there are these big social problems that don't really get gripped. The other, I think, is when we assume the market will take care of things. So your heat pump example, the kind of departmental answer would probably be, we'll create the incentives and regulations, and then hopefully people selling heat pumps will market to you, and you will decide to buy it from there.
Where were they when my boiler broke?
In the same way that you do with a car. So,
Nice idea isn't working.
Yeah. So I think it's sometimes interesting, what kind of problem are we solving, and are we categorising it correctly? As you have said, it's just 7 o'clock. I'm conscious of time. I do actually want to sort of make sure that I do bring in any sort of potential...
Let someone else speak.
Let someone else speak. If people want to come in with any kind of quick questions or comments as well, and perspectives, then happy to sort of take a few points from the floor. Maybe I can take 3 or 4 in one go, and then we can come back to Moira in a second. So one here from Alison, gentleman at the front, and then 2 ladies over there. Thanks. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks, Maura. This was real a memory lane hour. It was fantastic. Thank you. I guess I'm interested in what next, really, because we've made fantastic progress, but there are huge inequalities. There are 7-fold difference between rates in the highest rate areas and the lowest rate areas. There are inequalities within local authorities and inequalities between individual young people. And I think there is a sense of complacency that the job's done. So it's kind of what next? And I suppose the key points I would be is we've got to invest in upstream prevention. And people often say that's gone to downstream crisis management. So upstream prevention is investing in the training of teachers to deliver the statutory RSE well. But we also need to kind of restate it at national level. This is still important. Because otherwise it's going to fall between sexual health and 0 to 19's policy, and it needs to be grasped again, and that inequalities gap needs to be addressed. Otherwise we'll have great progress, but some young people really suffering.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, yeah, I was teenage pregnancy coordinator, and I was parent
Hurrah.
coordinator in Sure Stop Plus as well. I've moved on now to work in kind of child protection, but I was just going to echo what Alison was saying. So we see in the triennial analysis of serious case reviews where children die or come to significant harm, we see the prevalence of teenage pregnancy. I mean, as many coordinators, I was the daughter of teenage parents, so I'm the last person in the world to stigmatise them. But often it is around the lack of services around to be able to help. And I have to echo this point that you made, Moira, about the huge importance of having somebody whose job is totally to push out the values and the evidence-based practice, arguing with counsellors who also want to get this feckless youth under control, to say, actually, the silver ring thing that we do around abstinence in America is not going to work. Let me tell you about sexual health services. you know. And again, young people friendly services, I think, is so important, because in terms of harmful sexual behaviour and abuse in teenage relationships and sexual abuse, these are the services that are there for disclosure. So there's so much to be gained, but I think what happens now is things like, I don't know, modern slavery, for example. There's somebody somewhere, and it's added on to their huge roles as, say, a euphemistic Spock, single point of contact. So I think that's a real worry, that we just are cutting down on the people who are really kind of singly focused. But yeah.
Okay.
Hi, thanks. David Schley from Sense About Science. I'm really interested to kind of ask a question about kind of the transferable learnings for other areas. You talked about evaluation, and I guess, and I'm really kind of interested to know the process there in terms of, I guess, evaluating and adapting that. But we also know that government departments aren't really great at sharing insights when things aren't moving as fast or in the right direction as they want. So I'm kind of wondering, for your evaluation, how open were you able to be, and how much kind of external expertise were you able to draw in to adapt and develop the policy?
Okay.
Thanks for the presentation, Moira. I just wonder if you could say how you think the social exclusion unit would look different today in a more devolved settlement. So how would it work with combined authorities, for example?
Great questions. Thank you. Laura.
Quick responses. So, I mean, I completely agree that teenage pregnancy needs to be grasped again. And I don't know if the conception rate for under 18s will actually rise. It's been wobbling around a little bit in the pandemic, understandably, but I fear that it could. And actually it would still make sense to try to reduce it further. So I think that needs a focus, and I think it is related both to a whole range of forms of adolescent disadvantage that need attention, and they again include absence and school exclusion and off-rolling and fake homeschooling and drugs and a whole set of things that are at quite concerning levels, and in some cases have risen, having looked like they were coming down. So I really hope that at some point this is returned to, I'll put it that way. And I think I do think the importance of coordinators was massive, and I think they did focus on this, but they probably did a lot of other good along the road. And actually, there's a term in young people's work, no wrong door, that actually if you turn up and tell your dark secret, whatever it is, to the wrong professional, that professional should still do something sensible. And if actually you don't tell the modern slavery coordinator that you are in fact a victim of modern slavery, you hope that something good will happen. So I'm in favour of that coordination. I'll just try the evaluation question. There are loads of evaluations of policies that went on in that decade. You can read the evaluation of the teenage pregnancy strategy, and the reason people were very open about that, or relatively open, was because they had targets and they wanted to meet them. And I think evaluation, I'm sure, has come under financial pressure, but also if you never quite knew what your objective was, then how can you fail? I've actually read evaluations that have been written in the last decade that have started by trying to figure out what the goal of the policy was. So, they start with a long time. Well, we could see that there were these policies. Now, what were the aims of them? Because nobody ever said. Then try and guess the aims, and then try and evaluate how good they were at meeting them. So I think I'm quite keen on outcomes-based government. Of course, it carries political risk. You set a target, you didn't meet it. But I actually think it is hugely clarifying for delivery, and it also lends itself well to evaluation and therefore to learning. That's enough from me.
I can't help but sort of try to answer one of the questions just on evaluation. One of the things we've been thinking about is applying what you might call theory-based evaluations, where you look at the overarching policy, have a very clear theory of change. And then within that, you might have some aspects that you can experiment with and do randomized trials or other quasi-experimental methods to get really good understanding about the causal impact, and some which you can't apply that degree of proof. But overall, you are trying to build up a sense of the theory of change and which components you can feel confident about and which you don't. And I think that basically one of the biggest changes between now and the past is the quality of evaluation and the sort of the scientific rigor with which we do that. It does have some of its limitations. It can be a bit myopic, but I think the next generation of evaluation methods is trying to sort of bridge that gap. And then I think an interesting question about the sort of devolved.
Oh, I admit,
yes.
I was so fazed by that. I think that, I was thinking about this, I think that in one sense it wouldn't change anything because we would work with whoever was out there. We would, and SEU would work with whoever was out there. I think it might have changed some of the delivery in that actually it might have caused a national unit to say, I don't think I need a regional tier here, or actually this area is so big that it's actually able to learn and share good practice there, and I might step back a little bit if I thought that was helpful. So I think it might make me question slightly the input into that support and performance. Because that often happens, doesn't it? You think, oh, I've been doing this, but actually I can see this is sort of self-managing. But I think you would approach that on a bit of wanting to see the evidence first.
On that note, we will leave it there. Moira, I want to say thank you very, very much for such a fantastic talk and great conversation. This is the first of a series. We'll be trying to take other examples and case studies and draw out the lessons in a similar way. And we're also going to be sharing the lessons as we go and the write-ups from these conversations. So do sign up to future events, either here or online, and do also come and suggest if there's a sort of policy area anywhere in the world or here that you think that's worth mining for the lessons. Do get in touch and we'll take a look. But I hope you can join me in just thanking Moira again for a great talk.
It's been fun. Thank you.